Okay, great. Thank you all for coming to this talk. It's our great honor to have Professor Lin Zhicheng from Science and Technology, University of China, to give us a talk, very interesting, I think very useful talk, about writing and publishing better with AI, with generative AI. Okay, some background information about Professor Lin Zhicheng. I'm not going to repeat what is written here. I just wanted to know that both he and I, we graduated from University, also major in psychology. Okay, so we have really nice here. A lot of things to share in common. And then Professor Lin Zhicheng, right after he graduated from Peking University, he went to University of Minnesota and then worked with Professor He Shen. It's a prominent vision scientist who's now the PI of psychophysics, no, bioscience. 生物物理所，中科院生物物理所重点实验室。Anyway, got his PhD in psychology and did research on visual perception and attention, University of Minnesota, and right after that, and you did a brief postdoc with actually Lu Zhonglin. Who's not here, but we all know who he is. And then after that, Professor Lin took a job at the Chinese University of Hong Kong Shenzhen campus. And then so during that time, I think he just moved away from visual perception, kind of in basic like empirical research, more on the policy, scientific policy, and meta-analysis of the big issues in psychology. And his recent kind of research focus is the symbiosis of AI and psychology, which I think is very important. And some kind of roles, and after his job at the Chinese University of Hong Kong in Shenzhen campus, he now moved to another prominent university in China, the University of Science and Technology of China. And now it's one of the 100 talent professors there. And I want to say that Professor Lin is a great thinker, contributed a lot in terms of the scientific policy, the kind of big issues in the field of psychology. And he published leading journals in psychology, such as Psychological Science, a JP General, and which is a top class of psychology, and also in the field of behavioral science, like Nature Human Behavior, which I think in the field of behavioral science is the #1 journal. And not only that, and now he serves as associate editor of Psychological Science, which is the top journal in the field of psychology, as well as the Behavioral Research Methods, which is an important journal, kind of talks about methodology in the field of behavioral science. Okay, so without further delay, let's give a warm welcome to Professor Zhicheng Lin.
Thank you, Professor Li, for the introduction, and it's a great honor to be here again. Actually, I visited Professor Lin like 4 or 5 years ago when you were in the old location, but now it's nice to be here with this brand new building and everything. So today I'm going to talk about writing and publishing with generative AI. So I would say writing is hard for everyone. And here I have a quote from Kafka, Chinese Kafka, and that's a diary from almost 100 years ago. Said how time flies. Another 10 days, and I have achieved nothing. I think it's sort of similar to many of us. Sometimes we have this same experience. Now, another prominent philosopher, Wittgenstein, you are probably familiar, so did no work, will I ever work again? Dark mood. As you can see, writing really inflicts a lot of pain on us as writers. I'm sure for most of us here, that will also apply. Now, I think the good thing that is different from 100 years ago is that we now have AI, generative AI. So my talk today is how can we use AI to help us in the process of writing? Now, when I say AI, I think you're probably familiar, like language model. So when we say generative AI, we mean AI that can produce new things, like getting new text, images, videos, etc. Now, I will focus mostly on language model because that's the tool we are going to use in writing mostly. So this is some brief history. I think most of you are familiar with ChatGPT, right? Like at the end of 2022, or like about more than a year ago, that was when it came out, like ChatGPT 3.5, something like that. That's the time actually people got excited about this new tool. Now, before I talk about how you can use language model to help writing, I think it's important to understand how this language model actually work, right? So today's talk, I will focus on a brief understanding of how language model works, and then I'll talk about how you can use this tool to help with writing, publishing, and then I'll end with some thoughts. Now, I'm not sure we have VPN here or not, but if you want to use ChatGPT, for example, you do have to use, like, because China has no access to ChatGPT, but I'm sure you're smart enough to overcome this issue. Anyway, so that's the website. Yeah, do you have that?
Official VPN.
Oh, really? That's good.
Exactly like we.
Yeah. So,
as long as we're on campus, we don't even have use VPN.
oh, that's nice. Like when I was in Shenzhen, we have VPN too, but the VPN was connected to Hong Kong, and Hong Kong also does not have access to ChatGPT.
Yeah, does not have ChatGPT for access, but we would have access to ChatGPT 3.5.
Oh yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, makes sense.
Version.
I'll talk about that later. Yeah. Okay, so basically, I'm guessing you are familiar with this kind of stuff. So this is the interface. So you can ask a question. We call it a prompt. So basically, instruction, and you can see the output of the text is really smooth, human-like, very nice. Now, what is an LLM? I mean, it seems very easy to use. Like you ask a question, it gives you some answer, but it's actually more complicated than it appears if you want to use it well. Now, a language model, I think it's important to understand that it's actually boiled down to two files, because otherwise it's just complicated. What's a language model? So I use a Llama 2 as an example. Llama is from Meta AI, Facebook. And so as you can see here, you basically have two files, one called parameters, the other called the run file. So basically the parameter file contains all of the parameters of the neural network model, the language model. And then the run.c, the files to execute these parameters. So basically the magic of language model is in the parameters. Now, how can we get the parameters? So basically, there are two steps. The first step is so-called pre-training, where we can get the so-called foundational model. In this foundational model, you basically get a huge chunk of the internet, books, articles, etc., and then train this the model for a while, and lots of GPU as well. And then you got this file, the parameter file. That is the model we have. But with this model, you actually cannot have a conversation with this model because I will show you. So basically, the model will do something like prediction. I think I'm not sure whether I can move the.
Click OK.
That's okay. It's okay. I can just keep continuing.
That's the tool. Also,
It's okay.
some people realize
Louder. Okay. Okay. So anyway, so what I'm trying to say is that if you have the foundational model, you're not going to have a conversation with the model because it's going to make predictions about things like this. For example, if you ask something like the bad thing about AI is its ability, and you will just have an internal possible words with probabilities. So basically that's called randomness. As you probably understand that when you ask a question, the same question, the model will reply with different answers. So there's some randomness in the model. But with the foundation model, you actually have no conversation with it, because if you ask a question, it can reply just with another question instead of answering the question. So the key thing, the next step called fine-tuning, where we get the assistant model. So basically, you have a really question and answer type of text, like 100K of that. So for example, you have this text training. So the user asks a question about, can you write a short introduction about a concept? And then you have this answer about the concept. In other words, by training on this text question and answers, the model will understand, well, it has to answer the questions. So that's a key component of this fine-tuning. Another step is called comparison. Comparison is the idea that, well, if you ask a question, the model can make different answers, and your job is to choose the best answer. So that way, we can sort of instill our values or preferences into the responses, right? Like, well, the model can provide two answers, but you tell them, you like this model, this answer better. So in that way, you sort of tell the model what kind of values, preferences users would prefer. So basically, that's called reinforcement learning from human feedback, sometimes called. But in any case, this is the training step where we can get it really useful answering machine from the AI. Now, of course, from the user's perspective, the question is which model to use. There are lots of language models, as you can see here. Now, that's like, I show 4 major types of models on the market. ChatGPT, that I just mentioned briefly. Also the open source Llama 2 that I just mentioned. And then there's also Claude, there's Gemini, etc. So these are the mainstream models and others as well. As you can see here, these models differ in some major aspects. For example, the support for file. So some support image files, some support text files. So they all differ. And another important difference is context window, which means the length of history the model can remember. So if you have a conversation that's too long outside of the context window, then the model will not remember what you talk about at the beginning. So longer window is important. Another important difference is internet access. So if you want most up-to-date information, you want a model that has access to the internet, right? ChatGPT, for example. Anyway, there's so many differences. But I would say personally, I prefer ChatGPT 4, as you mentioned. So ChatGPT 4 actually requires subscription, like $20 per month. But I think it's well worth it. If you don't want to pay for it, you can use the free 3.5 model. That also works too, but not as well. Anyway, another model I like is the Claude model. The Claude model is very good actually at writing. It's for some reason there's some differences because of the training, because of the fine-tuning. But I would say, practically speaking, you should try different models and see which model works best for your own specific tasks and your preferences, right? So I think that is the basic recommendation. Now, it really developed fast. So for example, just March this year, we had this Claude 3. And then just last month, we had Llama 3. So in other words, this field really developed fast, unlike psychology. So it helped to pay attention to the development of this AI. Okay, now, if you say, well, what can you do with LLM, large language model? I can actually say that you can use it to do a lot of things, not just writing. For example, you can do it for data collection. I'm not saying that you can replace human participant. I'm saying that you can use it as piloting, right? Because it includes all kinds of text, right? And you can use it for like annotation. Like for example, if you have text and you want to classify the text as, for example, attitude, emotion, etc., you can do that with language model. And also data analysis as well, because I'm not sure like what really Do you use R, for example, or MATLAB or Python, etc.? Anyway, or you use SPSS, but really you can use these models to help you with coding and also visualization, like drawing graphs, etc. I think there's a lot of development going on. We're actually doing that all of the things in my own research. But today I'm just going to focus on writing. If that's you ask me to do. So writing. So basically I'll introduce how we can use language model for academic writing, and then we'll talk about publishing, and finally I'll just briefly talk about some outlook. Okay, now if you want to use LLM for writing, I'm sure the first step you need to understand how do you actually use language model well, and that's called prompting, prompt engineering, whatever term you might want to use. But as I said before, it's actually more complicated than it appears, because if you just ask a language model, like, help me write a paper, you know that it won't work well, right? It will just be terrible. So that's the thing. So people sometimes, when I introduce them to language model AI, and they say, well, try, it doesn't really help that much, right? It does appear to be that way. The problem is that you do have to learn to understand how language model works, how you can make the best out of this tool. So for example, I'll say, like, I'll give you some example here. Now, in many cases, you actually need to tell the model how to solve the problem. I would say guide the model solution. For example, use translation. Of course, you can ask the model to translate directly, but it wouldn't be as good if you give it instruction about the step to take. For example, the literal translation first, and then to do another step, obeying the rules, tradition, customs in the target language, right? So this is just a simple way. I'm not giving you like the detailed prompt, but that's just an example. Another way is to add relevant context. So for example, if you're going to find a job, you probably need to write a cover letter. You can ask it to write a cover letter, but it wouldn't be as good if you provide, like, for example, what is the requirement of the job? What is the resume, CV? If you provide this detail, it will provide better tailored cover letter. Another example is to be explicit in your instruction. So for example, instead of ask the language model to revise your text, ask it to act as a top editor, for example, for top journals, and to be more specific about the clarity and flow of the text. Okay. And another very interesting and important thing about language model is that it's so versatile. You can actually ask for lots of options just instead of just one, right? So instead of ask it to revise it in one way, you can ask it to revise it multiple ways. And then you can see the possibilities and you can choose the best suggestion they have, and then you can use it accordingly. Another thing, as I just mentioned, actually, is assign characters. So here, for example, act as a top editor, that's the same thing. So for example, if you want to, I'm not sure, like writing a term paper, for example, you can ask the model to act as a classmate or your TA or the instructor, for example, and then it will provide feedback based on these roles. Another thing is to say, show examples, do not just tell, similar to the idea I just mentioned. For example, if you want to ask the model to create visualization, you can actually provide an example of the kind of visualization you want a model to do. So that's helpful. And another option is to declare the preferred response format. That is because if you want the model to be specific, you want it to a specific response format. For example, if the text, if you're reading a paper is too complicated, right? You don't understand. You can ask the model to provide a response that is appropriate at your level or at some level below you. High school student, for example, right? And then that will provide some useful. Anyway, the final one I would say just to experiment, because I think the language model, the functionality is actually, in many cases, we don't actually understand well. And sometimes people call it emergent behavior, etc. That's because even the engineer, the developers, did not anticipate some of their characteristics. So in many cases, it would be helpful to experiment to see what works best. Okay. So now I just talked about how you can use language model based on better prompting. Now, of course, we are going to talk about writing. So that's the key of this talk. Now, writing is the same thing, actually, right? You want to use the right kind of prompt. to ask the language model to help you with writing. I would say I'll think about writing as a two-step process. I think it applies actually very generally to term paper, to research paper, etc. I think the first step really is to understand like what kind of value, what kind of contribution you have, whether you're having some new data or you're just proposing a new idea or concept, hypothesis. The question really is like, what kind of values do you have for the kind of targeted audience you want? Because sometimes you can think about it this way. You might have something that you think is very useful, but the audience may not necessarily appreciate it. It's really important to think from the perspective of your targeted audience. So in that aspect, and after that you have this outline, etc., then you can start the second stage where you actually do the writing. Now, when you think about how language model can help in this process, I would say there are two ways the language model can help you in the initial so-called brainstorming stage or outlining stage. So one is that you can ask it for imaginative inputs. So for example, you have some data, some ideas. You can ask the model to act as your targeted audience. So say you're a vision scientist, you might want to target your paper for vision scientists, but you might not. You might want to target it to neuroscientists or more broadly psychologists. I think they have different kind of expectations, right? So I think it's helpful to sort of ask the AI to adopt different kind of roles, provide sort of feedback on this value you can have for your paper. Another thing is called language support, more specific language thing. And that is to say, well, maybe you have a rough outline, and you can ask the AI to expand on the outline. You can ask the AI to, for example, to check the weakness of your outline based on logic, based on other considerations. And that is a very general way of thinking about it. And in the second step, when you're actually writing the paper, the AI can also help you in two major ways. One, I would say like feedback stage, more sort of like, well, similar to what I just mentioned. You can, after you're done with the writing, for example, or you have a paragraph, you can ask it for feedback. Like, well, does the writing sound like fluid? Does it sound like easy to understand, etc.? Another thing is more like cognitive offloading, which means like the language model can help you with the more mechanical elements. Like, for example, you might think about you want to change the word, right? You use a similar word or different words, etc. Or you might want to add examples, analogies, etc. And the language model can help you with that. Of course, this is very, very general broad, so I'm going to give you perhaps some details, like specific examples. But before I do that, I just want to show you like, well, what can it help you in terms of the levels of assistance? I mean, people worry about like, if you use too much AI, is it still ethical, right? That sort of question, that's the common question. I'm not going to talk about that right now, but basically I want to give you a sense of the kinds, the levels of assistance AI can provide. I would say you can start from very basic editing, sort of similar to Microsoft Word to help you with spelling, example like that. Or we can really provide high-level stuff, providing feedback, providing all this evaluation, etc. And now, the two ways you can use it, one I call direct way, that is to say the AI actually changed the text and you can use the text in your writing. That's called direct assistant. Another way is more like indirect, where the AI merely provides suggestions and you, as the author, the writer, need to evaluate the suggestion and implement the suggestion. In other words, this is very different because you're actually not copying any text from the language model. You are just using it for your own thinking, for your own implementation. So I think it is particularly helpful when you're actually trying to develop your writing skills, right? But in any case, you can use either way. Now, okay, so give you one example of basic editing. Basic editing, as I said,
so the slide, the stage one.
Yeah.
Okay, the previous slide. So to lay out the kind of this, the story, the outline, how does AI help with the kind of the outline, of the story for a scientific paper?
Oh, yeah. So I think it really depends on paper, but so say you have certain findings, right? Well, if you have a finding, then some sort of interpretation, you might ask the AI to help you with the interpretation. Like, I mean, sometimes you're not, like, it sort of give you some perspective, some possibilities, and then you sort of want to organize it. Of course, you can rely on the AI to provide one way to provide an outline of the results you have. Let's say you get some data, you have some findings. Now, how do you write a paper? How do you outline the paper? Of course, in a paper, we have introduction, we have methods, result, discussion, etc. You can ask AI, how do you write an introduction for this finding to target a certain audience? So when I say outline, it really means like the kind of thing you want to talk about, write about in your paper, right? So I would say method part is more straightforward, right? Results part is also a little bit straightforward too. But the introduction discussion is a little bit flexible. So that's when I think language model can help you in terms of like high level help, like imaginary input, like sort of providing you.
So I provide like these are the findings of my research, and I can tell for example, ChatGPT. So assuming you are the top editor of the top journal, how would you write an introduction based on the findings of this research?
Well, if you ask it to write introduction, that's actually writing the text. I would say more like how do you sort of sell this result? What's the value of this finding? Right. And then I would say it's always an interactive process where you're actually using AI as a tool. You never really rely on the AI because the AI after all is still not that good.
Yes.
So, but it's really helpful in many ways. So it's sort of give you a brainstorming, like instead of asking for a colleague, you can also ask AI in the same way. It's just that the AI can actually adopt many different roles, right? So I would say, for example, as I said, you can ask it, well, if you are editor in this field, what do you think about the results? And sort of you can look at the response. They may make sense, they may not necessarily align well with what you think. But anyway, this just provides some food for thought. And then I would say that it's sort of thinking process where the AI is sort of providing some non-human kind of feedback that I would say helpful.
But then this is really related to the ethics
Ethics?
question.
Ethical question. Yeah.
There's authorship, the credit.
Yeah, I'll talk about that later. Yeah, it's complicated. Yeah, it's complicated. Yeah, makes sense. It's complicated. Okay, so I'll give you an example, basic editing. That is really this kind of, I think a lot of tools actually have this kind of functioning, basic editing. So I'm not going to detail. Another thing I would call structural editing is interesting because, for example, a lot of time you probably want to paraphrase your own writing. So we call it plagiarize, right? Like a lot of times when you use the same methods, it's kind of hard to write it in many different ways. It's kind of tedious. I think that's totally fine to use it as a paraphrasing tool. Anyway, so that's structural editing. Another example is called creating derivative content. So that is to say, well, you have this paper, right? You probably can ask it to summarize the paper. Otherwise, just too long to read. Or, for example, you have your manuscript written, but you have not written your title or abstract yet. You can ask it to provide abstract or title based on the manuscript. I'm not saying you need to use it. They may not necessarily be as good as you want, but they're just providing ways for you to think about, right? It's sort of like, as I emphasized, it's always an interactive process. You never rely on it. It's just a tool, but it's pretty useful. Anyway, another example is generating analogies. In many cases, our ideas, our data can be actually hard for other people to understand. So if you can have very easy to relate to analogies, that can be very helpful for other people to appreciate, grasp your ideas. So I think that is also very helpful from the writing perspective. Now, creating new content, I think actually really cool in the sense that, now, if you talk about writer's block, like, okay, you write something, you don't know what to continue. And this is what I think AI is really useful and powerful. You can ask it to continue the text, right? What I'm saying is basically, you don't have to use what continues. But if you, after you're looking at the possibilities, you gain confidence and some ideas that you can actually continue in certain ways, right? So I think that is really, really powerful. And finally, it's about evaluation. In many cases, you can ask AI to serve as an editor or peer reviewer. there's prompt for that. And of course, as I said, it's basic, give you overall ideas of how to use it. And I will give you one example here. Actually, all of the prompts in the box of this article, this paper, and you can, based on this prompt, it's very specific, very long box, because this is a talk, I can't really use all the specific prompts here. But anyway, so if you go to this paper, you can look at the example prompt that I created. So you can use that for all of the functionality I just mentioned, including peer review, etc. But here I just want to give you one example to give you a sense about actually how it works. Now this is how I use it for basic editing. Now that's the example where I use ChatGPT 4. Now you can look at this prompt. I ask it to act as a top editor for top journal like Nature Science, and then ask you to take a deep breath. This is very important to my career. It can sound kind of weird, but in a sense, it actually works because it learned from the text. Because this is just really, anyway. And I asked you to offer 3 revisions instead of just 1. And why? Because I provide really specific instructions. First version is a copy editing one, where I ask the model to provide only necessary change. If it's just subjective or optional, don't change anything. And then ask it to do the second and third version based on the books, the guidelines in here. And I ask it to provide 2 distinct versions, because I want to see all kinds of possibilities, right? And then I ask it to provide output in 6 of only the change edited version, and tell me briefly what kind of changes does it make. And I also tip the language model. I mean, it's kind of weird, but in a sense that it actually sometimes works. I mean, it doesn't work all the time, but research has shown that if you use this kind of those emotional stuff or tipping stuff, it actually improves performance. I mean, it may not work in this case, but it doesn't hurt, right? Anyway, you're not actually paying it. Is it ethical? I don't know. I think it's fine. It's not human. Okay, as you can see here, this prompt used the strategy I just mentioned at the beginning. Now, I asked it to say conform with OK, and they said OK. Now, that's not the end of it, of course. Now, I asked it to write, so I input text for it to revise. Now, it showed 3 versions, of course, too long, I'm not showing here. The copy edited version is this, and then 2 other versions. Now, one of the interesting things about ChatGPT is that it has this called edit prompt button, where you can edit it and change it to another text box. So that's helpful because I can just keep doing it without having to input the very long form at the very beginning, right? So in other words, this is first, second, third, and fourth, right? I can always repeat here, right? So I don't have to do the first prompt all the time. That's tiring, right? I think that's helpful. That's why I use GPT-4 more often. But I also sometimes use Claude as well. Claude is also pretty powerful when it comes to writing. Okay, now come to ethics. Ethics is really complicated. Now I actually here have this so-called policy from various organizations, ICMJE, I'm not going to detail about those names. It's a medical association, and COPE is more efficient organization. This is also medical, JAMA, PNS, Science, Nature, Lancet, etc. Lots of, I organize it this way, as you can see here. Now you can see most of these organizations allow the use of AI. Sometimes they have some sort of like restrictions. So for example, no use of generative image. And here you can see here, Lancet said, well, you can use it, but only for readability and language only. Of course, it's a little bit confusing. What does it mean to be like language and readability? You know, it's like not like straightforward way of cutting editing into language only, not language only. What does that mean, really? But anyway, so that the point is that, well, you can really use it for all of these journals. One of the things that is different because Science used to ban the use of ChatGPT AI in January 2023, but later on in November last year, they updated the policy to actually allow it. In other words, really a dynamic process. Okay, now I'm not going to go into detail, but the gist of it is that most models, most organizations allow the use of generative AI, but they also say that the responsibility is with the authors. You want to make sure it's accurate. You want to make sure you cite the references correctly, etc. You have proper attribution, no plagiarism, etc. But in terms of like the transparency, it's a little bit complicated. Like, what do you report when you use AI? And some organizations just say you actually don't need to report anything because just like when you're using human editors, you don't have to report how you use human editors, right? And so it seems to make sense that you also don't need to report them when you use AI tools, right? But well, usually they will just say, well, maybe you should probably report something like, well, how you use the model, the kind of prompt you use, depends really on the policy. It's kind of like contradictory in some senses. But anyway, my personal way of using it is basically I report the kind of tools I use, and I report like how I use it. Like for example, I use it for copy editing, etc. I'll just give a general description of what I do. Right. I think that's just more like, yeah, it's just not feasible to report everything. It's too complicated. I mean, the problem is why it's nice to have complete recording. The problem is that people are not going to listen. It's too complicated to follow. People will just not tell you, right? So I think there's a trade-off of transparency and also the kind of like how much effort, how easy it is to comply with the requirements. So there's always this trade-off. Anyway, so that's academic writing with language model. I will show you at the end like WeChat group where you can scan and send you the paper, so you don't have to follow, like, take pictures or anyway. So I'll show you later how to get the papers. I'll send you the paper actually. Now just talk about how you can use language model for writing. Now next I'm going to talk about publishing, which is the next step, right? Anyway, so I think the question is, because some of you, maybe many of you are students, so I'm not sure like how relevant this is to you. But in any case, I think it's good to understand, because when you read a paper, you want to understand how the paper get published. Right? So how, hopefully, in the future, you might do a PhD or something. That also might be helpful. So publishing, I think the key thing is value, as I just mentioned at the very beginning. I think this is very different from as a student. Because as a student, when you write something, you basically give the teachers, pay the teacher to read your stuff. You pay them, right? The tuition, you know. But as an author, you ask them to pay you to write your stuff. Like we get paid as a professor, right? Or when you write it for a journal or art magazine, they pay you. So it's totally different. I mean, you can always pay your professor to read. They will always read, right? Because you pay them. But now, if you want people to read your work and pay you, that is a totally different thing. You need to provide value. I mean, lots of student papers are not very pleasant to read, honestly speaking. But we do it anyway, because that's what our job is. Now, when you come to really writing, the real work writing, you need to provide value. Nobody really care what you think, right? Nobody care, like, they care that what can you provide for them? Your writing, does it have value for them? If not, then they don't really care. They're not your parents, they're not your professors. Okay, now what do you mean by value then? Of course, I mean, from a journal perspective, they'll ask question, well, is it broadly interesting? For a top journal, they want lots of people interested in it. They can sell the journals for higher price, right? Subscription, right? Or is it important? Because if it's important, more people read it, right? Another thing is advance. Like, well, what kind of advance do you bring? There are lots of ways to evaluate it, either based on conceptual stuff, like kind of thinking style or ideas, but also sometimes it can be methodological. Method is really important. Another thing could be just like implication of societal impacts, right? It's just different dimensions. You can evaluate important and basic. Like evidence is kind of more like nature series. They really care about like where the evidence is substantial. You can look at Nature Communication. They really have long papers. And are they hard to obtain? Like for in neuroscience, people like intracranial recording sort of used to be published in Nature Neuroscience, Nature Science. Now it's also, I think it's still popular. No, it's just the data hard to obtain. Not because it's so hard in terms of conceptual stuff. The same thing with clinical trials or medical research. It's not that there's a lot of conceptually new things there. It's just because it takes tons of time, efforts to collect the data. So they make it important, valuable.
Okay.
And when I'm saying valuable, it doesn't have to be valuable to all people. Nobody's going, no, like you can't please everyone, right? So that's why you need to choose your journal, your audience properly. Your paper might be like valuable to some, but not to others. Like for example, if you're doing computers, like sometimes when we're doing research with computer science, like AI, in psychology, you have to think about, well, sometimes you want to sell them to psychologists. Sometimes you want to sell them to computer scientists. They're very different.
So yeah, so it depends on the stuff.
Now, the question you might have is, well, you might learn from your instructors or professors that, well, are we in the business of creating new knowledge? Right? Fill the gap, right? That's a common thing you have in your term papers, I think, right? Fill this gap, fill that gap. Is that important? I mean, the point is like, I don't think it's important. It's important to the extent that this gap, this knowledge is valuable to people, right? Think about it this way. Like how many people in this room? Nobody knows. You have to count. That is also new knowledge. But probably nobody cares, right? Makes sense? How many hair do I have? Nobody cares. Another thing is that, how about good writing? Of course, good writing is good. Entertainment, right? But in science, it's not enough. People don't read science to be entertained. Although being good to read, smooth to read, interesting is important. But definitely not, people don't turn to science or nature for entertainment, at least for most people, right? So that is not really that. Anyway, so it's valuable. Now, of course, you know, like there are two types of papers, empirical, like for research, primary research, or non-empirical papers. They're somewhat different, of course. I think in neuroscience, in psychology, people really emphasize empirical stuff, like primary research. But in humanities, in some social science, they also emphasize non-empirical, theoretical, conceptual insights. So anyway, so there's just epistemic perspectives are different, the value system. So it's kind of interesting because I think it also changed with time, so we don't know. And nowadays, for example, I think in psychology, I tend to also value like meta science in terms of like how the research is practiced, conducted. But people have different views, right? So anyway. Now, in general, I think you're familiar with the structure of papers, like abstract title, whatever. But there's some difference between like general psychology or medical paper, like method in the middle, whereas some like top journals, PNAS, Nature, Science, like they like to put a method at the back, but that's really just like minor changes. In any case, the question is, how do you write these different sections? Now, of course, I'm not going to detail because like for you, you're very familiar. For the students back there or somewhere, I'm not sure that's how important it is. But the question really is the same thing. Like why people need to read your work? Why is it valuable, right? So, okay, I'm just going to give you a brief idea of what I think about these sections are and sort of like the goals of these sections. Okay. Now, I think in totality, the paper is a story. I mean, I think you're familiar with the idea of story, like children's book, novel, etc. But science paper is the same thing. And just here, for example, you have to understand in introduction, the background. And the background is basically the premise, the location and time in the story, right? Once upon a time, something happened. And the same thing with the research. What kind of research has happened before you? Like that's the sort of background premise. Another thing is hypothesis. The hypothesis is sort of like protagonist in a story. Right? Like protagonist. And then you have to test how you test your hypothesis. That's sort of the event, what happened during the story, right? And then you have this results, that's the climax. And then you also have tension. That's because you have to rule out confounds, alternative hypotheses. That's where you have tension. People want to know, is your hypothesis correct? Or the confounds actually making the results, the hypothesis not very valid. So that is the tension stakes we have. And then we can have the conclusion, that's the resolution. And finally, if you want, you can have the future direction epilogue, whatever. So I think this idea is helpful in the sense that sometimes when we do a lot of research, we kind of like lose sight that the end goal of a paper is to tell a story about research finding, and that help you communicate your research. Okay, so how do you make this story sticky? The question, how do you make people read your paper, cite your paper, etc.? I think I would say that there's an acronym for success. Start with something simple. I mean, this might be like counterintuitive. People might want very complicated stuff, but I don't think so. I think simple thing is not simplistic. It's just one, because in a paper we put so many findings, it's so confusing. You want to have a simple thing, like something that people can grasp and understand that, wow, it's valuable. If we report different results, it's kind of hard to know which is really important, right? So that is one of the things. Unexpected in the sense that, a lot of people are really boring, to be honest. And that's because they're not unexpected, right? Or you ask not that really interesting question, right? You have to ask a question that is, oh yeah, that's a really interesting question. I read a paper about the other days. I think it's old friends exchanges, because you don't really connect with your old friends. I guess that makes some sense. That's interesting. Anyway, it's not necessarily unexpected, but it's sort of like interesting in a way that you kind of want to understand how it actually works. Anyway, concrete. Concrete, I think that's also very, very important. I think in psychology or in other fields as well, we tend to use terminology that are actually confusing and hard to understand. So when I say concrete, it means, for example, very specific examples. Reaction time, neural activity. These are very concrete, very specific. Or we can use very high-level schemas. Like, for example, if you talk about attention, people understand what you're talking about. You can talk about emotion. People understand what you're talking about. The problem is when you use terms that are in the middle. It's really confusing. Nobody really understands. It's not concrete. It's also not abstract enough. It's kind of confusing to understand. Okay, so you want something that is tractable, acquirable. That is, you want to provide details so that people understand that it's good. And emotional, that's the same thing I would say, similar to unexpected, but something like you want to engage curiosity, right? People want to read, keep reading, understand what's happening. Anyway, stories, you can say, think about like small stories, make up like big stories. They'll have introduction, methods, results, discussion, etc. Small stories that make up the large story. Okay, so that's a basic background. So I would say like one common mistake people make is about when they write a paper, they don't write with the reviewers in mind. So what that means is that when they write it, sort of like write it in a way that just not consider people that are not familiar with your work, right? Because from your own perspective, we're so familiar with our own research that we take for granted. We might neglect some detail. We might neglect to tell people why it is important. It might sound important to you just because you're so familiar with it or whatever. But it might not be the case for the readers. And so I think one of the things that would they actually understand what he was trying to say, right? You have to think, it's hard. It's hard because that's why AI can be helpful. You can ask AI to adopt a role as a stranger, an expert in a field, something like that. Because we are too familiar with our own stuff, and that is a curse of knowledge, right? That makes us really ignorant of other perspectives. So we want to think from other people's perspective. Someone who doesn't really, who read your paper for the first time, would they understand it, right? Would they get confused? Another thing is, well, would they really care? That's really important. I mean, they're not your parents, right? So you have to really convince them that it's something that they need to care, right? And finally, how they actually challenge it. If you have something important, you can bet that the reviewers and the reader will try to think about what kind of weakness you have in your paper, confounding issue, other stuff like that. So how they challenge it. And by thinking about it, you can preempt them, right? You can adjust them before these issues arise. Sometimes that means you need to conduct a new experiment with different analysis, etc. But it's also good because you just have a better chance of getting accepted later on, right? Because the process is really long. Anyway, so my own routine, I would say, is this. I developed this routine based on I call it write routine. So first you write the results first because they're easy, right? They're relatively easy, but you want to do it early on. You don't want to wait like a few months after you're done. That's kind of, you forget everything. So do it first. Another thing is after you have the methods and results, you actually have to write the introduction, and that's hard part, discussion. And you have to sell the stories, sell your findings, right? That's hard part. So you have to read these papers, background. So what's new in your stuff? Did you solve a debate or something like that in the literature? Anyway, you have to sometimes talk to other people, think about what they think about the research, right? And then write down the relevant thoughts. I usually like write it down, like certain points I want to make, etc. And then I will just organize this.
I was calling.
Imagine. Oh, not yet. Oh, anyway, imagine. So that's what I have. I get the points here. So in other words, when you write a paper, you have this point. Okay, so now I know the main contribution
In my research.
and that's the core of your stuff. And the next step, you want to think about, well, how would people actually challenge it? You have to imagine, because people will definitely poke holes in your work. So you have to think about what kind of potential criticism they have. So that's why it's important sometimes to talk to other people, right? It's really important. I mean, it's kind of hard because we don't really think through that for our own work, right? And that is just, I mean, in many cases, I find my work really perfect. And then send out for review. Well, the reviewer come back, it's like, not good, not perfect. So, and anyway, we're getting better. But anyway, that happened to everyone. It's just very difficult to do that. And then I just, all of these things, and then tie them up into the story. So I now know how to organize these things so that I can convince readers that this is really valuable work. And then finally, after you're done, you actually have to do a lot of editing. Just because writing is editing. The first draft is not that perfect. Depends on the person, but in any case, editing is always important. So that is my basic routine. I don't think we have a lot of time, so I'm going to go really fast. Okay, so I'll talk about some tips first. Okay, so procrastination, that's happened to everyone. As I said, writer's block, etc. But I think now with AI, it can actually help a lot. But what I said before, you write the method and results first because they're relatively easy. Okay, and then you do the outline, etc. First job editing, and that's the steps we have. Now, I think I would say one of the things I will talk about is that outline is never fixed. During the writing process, you might change your point of view, etc. So totally fine, it's fluid, right? Another thing I would say during the first job is that you won't resist the temptation to edit to perfect every sentence. And that was my mistake. I want to make every sentence perfect. Problem is, I spent an hour perfecting a sentence that's never going to be used later, right? Because when you're editing the paper, you realize it's not actually needed anymore. And the problem is because you spend so much time on it, you're reluctant to let go, right? Happen, right? So I think that is one of the things. I think editing is another thing I will talk about editing is that I think we want to focus on logic first. Because if your logic is weak, it doesn't really matter. Because everything else needs to be changed later. You don't change that first. And then you focus on clarity and language after that. Okay. And then reference, I think it really depends on how experienced you are with the writing. I used to write and add the reference like really step by step. But now when I write, I usually write the first job without any references at all, and then add the reference back later. The reason is because that wouldn't interrupt my thoughts, my thinking. Because if you find that reference, kind of interrupting and disrupting. So of course, for students, you might not necessarily be familiar with what kind of reference you use. So it really depends on your experience, and also you need to find your own style, right? But I would say for me personally, that would just get a good flow by doing the reference later. I mean, you can do that, just like take notes of the reference you have. That's something that can help you. Because when I'm writing, I'm really familiar with the background already, so I don't really need to set a reference at the very beginning. So I think that's some general tips I have. Now, because I don't really have time, I think I'm just going to, yeah. I was just talk about some common things, like, for example, methods. I mean, people think about methods as being really easy to write. I don't think so at all. When I work with students, I have to basically rewrite everything. And that's because when you write a method, you actually have to think about from the from another reader's perspective, would they actually follow your work methods? Would they be able to reproduce your work? A lot of times when we write our methods, we ignore a lot of details because we're so familiar with everything. And that is a problem because you have to really think from the stranger's perspective.
Right.
So that's a method. I would say just write it early on. That's because you will forget everything after a while. And key detail, organize it. Organization is really important because a lot of time method is not just dumping every detail there. You actually have to organize it, make it logical and people easy to follow. Otherwise, it's just so confusing to evaluate your work or understand your
Work. So I think it's really important to organize it.
figures are also important to help illustrations.
I'm not going to detail about it.
But now I think in science, in psychological science and neuroscience as well, I think lots of open science emphasis, the meaning that you want to make stimuli, code, materials available online. So I think it's a really big change. Workflow can used to be like everything is in the dark. You do it in your own lab, nobody really tidy them up. Now it's very different because you need to make it open. You actually have to take care of organizing your work. I think it actually takes time, but it's actually helpful because, you know, you catch mistakes in the process. And also it helps you to understand your work better later on. Like for example, it really is a common thing when you finish a project, 2 years later, half a year later, you don't really understand what you did. That happened really. I think with code, when you organize everything well, wow, it's just so much easier for yourself to understand the details of your work. So I think I also champion open science just because, you know, there are lots of benefits. And there are, of course, some costs, but I think it's the benefit outweighs the cost. So I think that you want to take that into consideration when you're starting your project because you have to do it anyway. So why not do it, in a good way at the beginning, right?
So that's one thing.
Results also seemingly easy, but I also find it students may have, in psychology at least, have some really misconception of doing results thing. The typical or unfortunately a bad way of writing result is just to focus on the statistics, like ANOVA showed this. And the problem is, as I said, it's a story. You don't really care about statistics. The statistics are there to support your findings.
Right.
The key is not the statistic. The key is your finding.
Right.
I think that, I mean, I'm not sure whether it's too abstract or not, but if you compare a paper in PNS, Nature Science, with a paper in, I don't know, GeoV, Journal Vision, or something like that, you can see the big differences. So I think that's unfortunate. I think we should try to write in a way that's narrative, that's easy to understand, instead of focusing on statistics. Because really, we don't really care about statistics, not in the sense that because it's just a tool to help us understand the results. The findings are the key.
Okay.
So I think that is key. Okay, and sometimes I think there are lots of things right now, I think, with online publishing, so you can actually use supplemental material if you want to report supplemental stuff. Because I think you don't want the result to be too long either, because that is actually hard to comprehend. And so organization is super important to make people have a sense of what is coming in your results section if they're too long. So you say, okay, I'm going to organize it into 3 sections, whatever. So people get a sense that, okay, now I know that I'm going to read 3 sections in this 3 stuff, right? Because otherwise people just say, okay, keep continuing. They never know when it's going to stop. And that is not nice. Anyway, so I think organization is important. Okay, introduction, that is really a difficult part because, you know, that's the most difficult part of it. But you need to understand the goal is not like, you know, set what you have in your mind, but to convince people this is really important. You have made important contribution that they should read it, right? Publish it. Like, so that's you want to convey is important. As I mentioned, every journal is a little bit different. So you probably want to understand like what is paper journal value. But it's pretty much this overall is pretty much the same thing. That's one something that is really valuable to a lot of people. If you buy a really nice advanced, etc. So I think that's really important. So you can start, I think for top journals, you want to start with something that is like make the context clear. That is to say, well, why this work is really important in the grand scheme of things. Like, well, why should people care this topic? Right. And but of course, you don't want to be too long. Because journal space is limited, so you've got to like be like on point, right? anyway, so I think this is sort of like,
Are these good prompts for the AI? Chat AI.
yeah, you can do that. You can do that. I don't really do it myself because I think for me, I don't do this that much, but I think it's the same thing. If you want to do it, you can definitely try it to see how it actually produce. You can incorporate it. Sometimes I do use it because like I think the problem is that hallucination, like empirical research is not as good because if you ask like a phenomenon, of course there's some specialized AI tools as well that they can sort of give you some background. I sometimes use it for a field I'm not familiar with to get a sense of what's going on there. But for a field I'm familiar with, I don't think I use it that much. But I think it's helpful that there's a possibility there.
Yeah, I think it's good to generate the general context.
Yeah.
But
So
in terms of specific stuff,
yeah,
curious.
at this point is not
Very accurate.
Yeah. So anyway, so you want to ask an important new question. You want to say how you adjust that question. That's pretty common sense, but I'm going to detail. I think a lot of times is that it's not about just writing. A lot of people blame writing, but it's not. Writing good introduction is not just about writing, but more about how you think about this problem. It really tests your understanding of this field. Right? You need to understand well what's really important, what's really new here in your work, and that really require good understanding. So that's also why students don't really write well for the introduction. Really, that's because students you typically don't have a deep understanding of the field. If you don't have a deep understanding of the field, it's kind of hard to convince people that you actually have a good contribution over there.
So I think that
takes some time.
understanding thinking.
And I think a common thing that happened to me and other people is that when you write the first paragraph, it tends not to be really relevant. Like when you start to write, sort of write something that's too far away. So I usually encourage you to like discard the first paragraph you write. Sometimes it's not really that relevant. Anyway, so edit it at this. Okay, I'll give you some example from PNS. So that's the introduction they have. But you can see here, they give you a background, first introduction, the first paragraph. So basically the background of this research. And they ask the question, what is the so-called less quantitative understanding of something? So what do they do here? So anyway, so it's basically there's some sort of structure here, okay? But there's no one way to do it, okay? So the basic structure is here, but another example here. So for example, they have lots of background here. But until then, they have this new thing that they contribute the new paper. So that's because they were talking about a really controversial point of view, like say, well, scientific progress would suggest more is better. So that is sort of like a mainstream view, so they won't expand on it, and then they would tell the new story that why it's new here. Okay, which is saying that is not the case. It's actually interesting paper. I think my point here is basically to give you two examples that's kind of different in terms of when they jump to the research. One jump to the research really quickly, another not as quickly, but very engaging nevertheless. Right? So there's no fixed one way of writing, although the basic idea is the same. You want to convince people your research is important, interesting, etc. Whatever way that can achieve that is okay. So I think that's just okay. Now discussion, I think will be probably just you are familiar with contextualize your finding, and so that I'm not going to detail here, but because I think you're familiar with the discussion part. And this is one example. So they talk about implication, they talk about counter arguments, then they talk about other considerations. They end with a really interesting question. That's actually a very nice way to end the paper, right? So that's paper in PNS as well. Now, we just talked about discussion, but then as I talked about before, I usually write a title and abstract later after I'm all done. Of course, you can use AI to help you. But in general, you think about title as informative, concise, but also interesting. So I give you basically because you know it's sort of an advertisement. You want to draw the readers in, right? Same thing with other things. Like here, I'll give you an example of in sociology. So the strength of weak ties. That sounds really interesting, right? It has a contrast. You want to read it. Another example is in psychology, the weirdest people in the world. Oh, what are the weirdest people? That pique your interest, right? Another is from AI, attention. Attention is all you need. That's the transformer paper. Oh, that's interesting. What do you mean by all we need? Attention, provocative, right? Attention is all we need. Okay, you want to read, what does it say? So I think that's just kind of the title. I'm not saying that every title needs to be like this. I'm just saying that this is some example we can think about. Okay. Now, abject really, I'm not going to detail here. Abject is just the sort of condensed version of
Your summary. Okay.
I'm
Okay.
not going here to abstract. There's one example of abstract, another example. Okay, references. I think this is sort of actually very trivial in one way, but not in another way. That's because I think a lot of times people actually don't read the references inside the paper. And so that leads to a lot of mistakes. So I think that's actually important to at least get the abstract title of the references.
Exciting.
Another thing, as I mentioned before, you can usually insert your references after completing the first draft. That's don't interrupt your flow, etc. Anyway, and there are lots of mistakes I mentioned, so I'm not going to talk about that. Now, when we talk about we just mentioned about empirical article, right? And empirical articles are a little bit different. So in this case, like for example, we have change in cognitive neuroscience or cognitive sciences or whatever. Change in neuroscience, change in cognitive sciences or nature review series. So this is very different from the empirical research. They will usually ask you for proposal. How do you write a proposal, right? Oh, so why this topic? Why now? Why you want this? Anyway, I'm not going to detail because
I guess most of you are not familiar.
I'm not really interested in that. Okay, I think, should I talk about these things?
Yes,
Okay.
it's okay. I mean,
Because I'm a student, I'm not sure. Okay, now when you're submitting papers, there are lots of things that people can think about. Like, well, do you want to submit the paper to the most desirable journal you want, or the most probable journal? I think kind of hard to say, right? You can choose the first choice. If it works, great. That's what you want. But sometimes people also choose the second choice first. Why? Because they want to test the waters, see how the reviewers evaluate this work. Yeah, so they want to see that, and also it's easier than the first choice normally, right? And then they try to see the feedback, because usually they won't accept your paper right away. If you really think you undersell your paper, right, you can submit to the best journal possible, your choice. Make sense? Because it happens all the time, right? And I think the problem with current academics is that there's a lot of competition. I think second choice sometimes may be faster, right? I mean, I would say like, yeah. I mean, most people go with first choice first, I understand. But sometimes it might be helpful to go with the second choice. Because if the reviewers say, your work is so great, well, you might want to submit it to some other journal. But normally they'll just say, but anyway, so that's one possibility. On the cover story, I think I'm not going to
Detail here.
So basically, I think you know what the cover story is. The cover letter is for a journal. It's basically for the editor to read. I basically want to understand why it is important, because like Nature series, they're not really working scientists, more professional scientists. They may not necessarily be familiar with your own research. So sometimes you have to tell them what stories. Comparison with most relevant work, etc. Take a message. Okay, so that is some sort of mechanicals of the cover letter, right? But you want to talk about, so you want to make it more easy to understand why you submitted for that journal and potential reviewers, etc. These are more common things. Now, I think I would say some sort of like, what do you deal with rejection? That is pretty common. I think as academics, it's really hard. So I'm saying, for most students, I would just suggest not going to PhD at all. It's because, I mean, it's just so hard for a lot of people. And also the job prospect is not really good. Salary is also not high. I mean, it's good for some people. I mean, now you're like, I normally don't recommend it to anyone at all, unless they really, really want to do it.
I think that makes sense.
And one of the things particularly, you always deal with rejection all the time, like, unless you want to submit to the worst journal. Otherwise, top journal always reject a lot of papers, right? And what do? I think it's really important I mean, rejection always hurts, more or less, depends on like, how good, or how experienced you are, how you're used to it, right? If you're used to it, then you get better. Like right now, if I get rejected, I sort of okay, even though it hurts a tiny bit. It's not that bad because I sort of when I submit a paper, I just lower my expectation. Okay, it's going to be rejected. So if you get rejected, okay, fine, I expect it, even though it's a little bit disappointed, right? If you get accepted, that's great. I'm so happy, right? So that's the thing. So I think low expectation will help. I think that sometimes it's really important to just like turn the emotional self off in the sense that just like exercise, you just do it without thinking. Like dealing with rejection, the same thing. Think about, you don't want to think about all the things. Think about what you can do. Focus on the action instead of feeling. I mean, people have different coping methods. That's how it works for me. Low expectation, trying to turn off the emotional brain, focus on the action. Anyway, so how can you, I think you need to have expectation that top journals reject a lot of papers. And sometimes authors might not be aware, but it's the case that the editors can deviate from the reviewers. Say the reviewers are very positive, the editor can still reject the paper. Don't say it's unfair, because the editor has the power to reject the paper. Right? The converse is also true. The reviewer can say bad things about your paper, and editors might actually agree with you instead with the reviewer. That happens too. Not very often, but it happens. That's also possible. And I think just like persevere, like that's the business of an academic. They always submitting for grants.
Research papers, the same thing.
I think sometimes it's helpful to choose the appropriate journal because I have a co-author. Probably don't talk about it. Anyway, so I know someone like yeah. Anyway, submitted to lots of journals, 10, 20 top journals, get rejected all the time. I mean, I understand the incentive to publish in top journals, but sometimes it can hurt. Like it can be very demoralizing, right? So I think that is something not good. Just try to choose the appropriate journal. Sometimes it's important to get it out first instead of going to the top journal, right? I think sometimes you have to strategize, right? Particularly some fields, it's actually more important to be faster than be published in top journals. That's like COVID-19. I remember the COVID-19 at the time, lots of crappy papers get published, and then got lots of citations. You know, sometimes that's just yeah. Anyway, so another thing is that when you get rejected, do you appeal? I mean, that happens too. I think it just doesn't work that well often. In many cases, you want to make sure you have identified some factual mistakes in the reviewer or editor's comments, because oftentimes it's really subjective evaluation. There's no right or wrong. People just can, you know, it's kind of subjective to some extent, but it is important. You know, we are not doing math. Math is a very objective thing. If you can solve that theorem, you're the number one, right? There's no question about that. Like psychology, neuroscience, empirical science is very different. You're not solving cancer, right? You're just finding something. Is that important? Well, it depends, right? Who knows? Sometimes it's kind of complicated. So anyway, so that's like the business of social science or neuroscience, empirical science. Sometimes really complicated to evaluate. In any case, you have to. It's better to identify factual mistakes if you want to appeal. Otherwise, it's wasting your time. You can do it, just like not very helpful, right? Okay. Now, sometimes the reviewer can be really harsh. That happened too. But I think, and again, you sort of turn off the emotional brain. I think when the harshest review I got when I was a student, when I was a PhD student, was that well, one reviewer said that the author was trying to justify his work. As to say, he's trying to say that we have nothing better to do, so I write that paper. Does that make sense? Like, I'm not sure it's he or she, but the reviewer said that I'm basically trying to justify work in the sense that I'm trying to justify doing something that is trivial, something like that. Anyway, along the line, it's got it anyway. A little bit subtle, but anyway, that is one of the harshest review I got. But anyway, that's okay. A common thing when you got rejection or thing, you try to guess the reviewer. But that often is not the case, not work, because you know sometimes you can submit, for example, recommend a friend. That friend might not necessarily be friendly to your work, because people would still try to be objective, right? If they identify flaw, they will tell I mean, hopefully. Anyway, another thing is take them serious, but not really personally. But because I think it's always useful to think about, like, from the feedback, what can you improve, right? Even if the viewer misunderstand your work, you might want to think, well, could you write it clear, more clear, right? Just that sort of thing. So think about it, how you can improve your work. And it's another thing I think it's important to communicate with the editor, because a lot of times, like, if the revision request, or if you think there's something not right, you can always ask the editor for clarification, etc. So that's good for in the communication, because the editor has the power to override some things, or just certain things to be not important in the revision process. So you can always communicate. Okay, so another question people usually have is that, well, can you submit the paper after you get rejected, even if the editor said no? And that's complicated, but actually, I think you can actually do that. But you want to convince the editor to treat it as a new submission. It usually happens when you have really good new reasons, like new data, for example, that sort of change the story of your work, right? And that you have a chance. And then you want to make clear the cover letter. Anyway, so frame your response or your letter as not like they make mistakes, so instead like saying, well, how I actually improve a lot in your new work, right? So the best case is just to convince the editor that, well, this work we consider as a new submission, right? I think that is one thing you can try to do. That actually work too, sometimes work. And for myself too, I have paper rejected, and then I will submit it after lots of new stuff. So I think that's totally fine. Another thing that people have is like, well, could you submit to the better paper after you get rejected? And that doesn't happen often, but it's actually totally possible. For example, one of the story I Shanghai, I think he had the paper with Tom Carlson, which they submitted to Journal of Vision, which was rejected. And then they submitted to New One and got accepted.
Oh my gosh.
And it totally happens sometimes.
What paper is that?
The paper was about adaptation, I think. It wasn't really well cited, but anyway, it made.
Did they do an experiment, or they added more experiments?
I'm not sure actually. I don't think they do a lot. They change something, but not a lot. So it's kind of sometimes there's some randomness in the process. Anyway, so I'm saying is that it's totally possible. But the point is, like, even though it's possible, you have to consider your time. Like going through the journal now is very competitive. I mean, 10 or 20 years ago, remember it used to be common to publish in Nature in Science based on psychophysics behavior. Now it's impossible, right? You can try, but it will never work. So we just need to be realistic. Nowadays,
That is now novel, I guess.
Yeah, time has changed. So kind of, Anyway, so I think it's possible to, you just have to evaluate your work in an objective way and then see how it might fare in different genres. Okay, if you got revision, it's actually a good thing usually. It has a good chance, no guarantee, but it's a good chance. So I would say just like, I think probably aware, but just try to be diplomatic and try to be comprehensive in your addressing the criticism, comments from the reviewers and editors, because it's helpful, because then you don't have to go back and forth multiple cycles. This depends on the field. Like in neuroscience and psychology, it's totally possible for one round of revision to be done and get accepted. But in management, sometimes it's pretty common that 3 rounds of revision and get rejected. So I think try to be comprehensive, to try to address the question really well. So in that sense, you can get your paper accepted faster. Okay, I think that is what I have about the how to use AI language model, writing and publishing. Now I want to just leave the outlook for a few minutes, 2 minutes, 3 minutes, some sort of thinking. Now I think why I embraced AI relatively recently. When I was a graduate student, I studied vision and also learn a little bit about computational vision, which basically use computational methods to understand the visual process. At that time, I think my understanding was that the models were really bad. They were terrible at recognizing objects, everyday objects. So I really did not pay attention to AI at all at that time because at that time I just thought, oh, it's never going to work. Human vision is so complicated, etc. Nowadays, the story really changed with the convolutional neural network, with all kind of this neural network stuff. You know, a really interesting book called Genius Maker, a book about a story of the development of this AI, generative AI neural network. Really interesting book. But anyway, what I'm trying to say is that why I embrace AI is because I think really AI is the quantum evolution that is not so different from industrial evolution. So think about like steam engines, factorial streamline work that really changed society. I think in the future, is AI ignited quantum revolution is going to have similar impacts to our work as well. I mean, short term, you already know that like stock market, you know, actually I want to talk about it because I gave a talk like early last year, 2023 in sport management and economic at CUSK Shenzhen. At that time, I really talk about stock market because I think it's very different from the internet bubble. The internet bubble at that time was like a lot of promise, no real deliveries. But AI is different. They really deliver. They improve productivity. I give you an example of writing, for example. So that's at that time I just recommend them to really. I didn't ask them to invest, but I just say you can invest. So at that time, at least I did it, right? Because I think sometimes it's really interesting when you do AI, you can also do some. It really helps you make money as well. So I think it's sort of an interesting thing. Anyway, so yeah, so I think this cognitive evolution is going to change the world anyway. So I'm not going to talk about that. But in terms of writing in the context, there's lots of concerns about, like Professor Lee mentioned about ethics, for example. Lots of things people just ask, well, if you use AI, you can create a lot of bad papers, right? And currently, as you are aware, probably we have paper mills, factories that sell papers to researchers. You can think about it, particularly in China and lots of countries like Iran, developing India as well, where, for example, if you have incentive to publish papers, particularly for doctors, clinical doctors, they have no training, they have no background, but they have to publish paper, then you can imagine there's a market there. People will always publish paper. So with AI, I think that problem will be exacerbated. But I would say it's totally fine. It's not a big problem because I don't think, frankly, people read these papers, right? It doesn't really matter. And I said that's because science is a strong link enterprise in the sense that science is not driven by these bad papers, but driven by the best research from, Einstein or whatever. All this new theory, new real stuff, they drive science and human society forward, right? And in psychology, neuroscience, the same thing. I don't think like you really read those papers that, from this never heard of journals. So I think it's just a game that people play. And I don't think it really fundamentally affects the development of science, right? So I don't think that is a big problem at all. But it's a concern, though, in education that when students, for example, overuse AI, I think I heard lots of faculty members, professors mention about this. Like, well, when you have an assignment, the student just use AI to create the term paper, for example. It's not fair because you have to evaluate it. You spend a lot of time to grade the paper, whereas the student might just spend a few minutes creating that term paper. I think that's a real issue, but I think that's not a good reason to prohibit the use of AI. But instead, I think just need to adapt our education to this new reality. We need to assume AI is going to be used instead of not used. So, for example, you can just really incorporate AI into your classwork, right? Classroom activities, or you can do some sort of instead of term papers, you can do it other things, right? For example, you can do it like in class stuff, right? Oral exams, even if this class small. All these things, I think there's lots of ways we can do to adjust our teaching to the new reality of AI. Okay, and that is what I think about this quantum revolution. I think it's going to transform our life. education,
Yes.
sure. In terms of research, I think it's overall a good thing. I don't think it's a bad thing at all because it really increased productivity. I don't think it mattered at all when people use it for like creating fake paper or whatever, because it doesn't really matter. Nobody really read these papers. Now that is what I'm talking about like right implication for research and education. Now I think there's some I don't have time to talk about this. Like now I think I just want to comment a little bit about a recent change in publishing. The change is that we have more authors than ever per paper. For example, now we have this so-called like Delphi study, the consensus studies, or there's like big collaboration teams. I think in neuroscience as well, in psychology as well, each paper has more and more authors with each passing year. So that's authorship size is bigger. The part that we now emphasize open science. I think there are lots of reasons. One reason is just because science is getting more complicated. Collaboration between multiple. Think about a paper in Nature. It used to be really simple. Now it's like you have to like tons of data. And yeah, it's getting crazy. So that is one legitimate reason. Another is just because, I think there's just like incentive citation, publication numbers, right? You give me a paper, I give you a paper. We have two papers, that sort of thing. That happened too. I mean, it's just like all kinds of reasons. Yeah. Like sometimes if, for example, a program director or chair or whatever, they may want a faculty to co-author with them. That also happened too. There's also this kind of complicated. It makes sense just like any other industry. That's incentives, as long as you care about the number of paper citations. I mean, think about it this way.
Especially in China, right?
Yeah, I think, yeah.
Greater collaboration, major grants require collaboration between.
Yeah, and also, yeah, they're getting crazy. And also, I think,
Yes.
yeah, China is
Complicated.
I'm not sure I want to talk too much about it. It's recorded. Anyway, I'm pretty frank about it. Anyway, so another important thing is about reproducibility. I think you're probably aware of in psychology, we have this so-called, and not just psychology, so science, medicine, science as well, reproducibility problem. And in psychological science, we emphasize now so-called computational reproducibility, which means that if you give us the code, and we use the code to recreate the results. I think that's important because, oftentimes you might say you have this code, this data, but they might not necessarily reproduce the results. Another thing I think in psychology, particularly about generalizability, meaning working out results, generalize to a different situation, population, stimulus setting, etc. I think this is getting more and more serious about this issue in diversity as well. Diversity, I think, is many aspects, like samples, right? Not just like, as I mentioned, like Western sample used to be dominating psychology and medicine as well. Now I think we have more emphasis on diverse samples, and also in editing as well. Regression is also one way that people try to use to compare degree of freedom, like where you register the design question analysis so that you can tell people, well, what you're going to do. Then, because otherwise, particularly in social psychology, it's just like, well, get a finding, make up a story. They say, oh, yeah, predict this finding, and they actually did not. So I think that happens a lot. And register report is a more formalized version of that, where you submit your protocol before you collect data for peer review. Now, lots of journals actually accept register report. So this kind of thing is more like emphasis on the question, the design. As long as the sound get accepted before people know the result. That's cool, actually. Another big change, I think, in experimental psychology, online crowdsourced idea, I think. Anyway, crowdsourced research. So the Prolific is a UK platform where I think we have Wenjunsing, etc. But Wenjunsing is more like for questionnaires. Like in experimental psychology now have like perceptual experiment online as well, cognitive experiment online as well. So that have bigger sample size, more diverse samples, etc. I think that's a trend. Like as I review, edited psychological science, see like lots of papers that actually use Prolific. But I think in China, we don't really use it that often. That one thing I noticed. People still use like laboratory experiments a lot, actually. I don't know why. I think like, yeah, it's interesting thing I noticed. So I try to encourage people to use online samples to see, to compare. I think at the very beginning, I used to ask a colleague about it. They don't really trust it, the online studies, just because it's so hard to control viewing distance, etc. But now we have more and more tools to do help controlling these parameters. But overall, I think that's an interesting thing. Another thing I want to comment on for the medium, like now I think we have open access. I want to talk about things like publishing a paper before you get peer review. I think another interesting possibility is called non-journals, where, I mean, we used to publish, we are publishing papers in academic journals. But now people ask the question, well, do we have to actually use journals? Why not just publish it like regular blog post? You can ask people to evaluate it. You can read it. It's really important. It's no different from a journal article, right? Of course, I think it's hard because academic system is so slow to change. So probably not very well accepted for now, and it's kind of hard to tell what the development be in the future. But anyway, so that's one possibility where, it's somewhat more like, I think it's actually interesting possibility. There's a lot of criticism about the review system, about the journal system, etc. Another thing I would talk about is social media, attention economic in terms of impact. I think the problem is that now, as you can see here, like people, you have computers, you have laptop, you have phones where you can use videos, social media, etc. Now, if you think about it, like 50 years ago, 30 years ago, we don't have any of those things. And at that time, we actually don't have lots of journals and papers, so people really keep up with the literature. Now it's just so almost impossible, right? Like, I think, frankly, if you ask me, I don't really read so many papers. Lots of papers, I don't really read it.
Name journals.
Yeah. Unless it's really relevant, like when I'm writing a paper, I have to keep up with literature, take a look at what people have done, and then I will just do lots of reading. But in day-to-day life, I just don't read anymore. I don't know like how other people work. I'm just saying that there's a real thing here that's happening. That is, people just don't read papers anymore. Or at least not.
It's like list to talks.
Oh yeah. But anyway, so I think it's just very hard to keep up with this attention economic, just because there's just lots of entertainment, distractions, whatever you want to call it, where paper is just not as high a priority, given that so many papers, right? So I think my question is like, well, we have so many papers in so little time, and then our paper is getting longer and longer, as I'm just mentioned. For example, viewers usually ask for control, more tests, more data, more longer tests, more text, whatever. They explain a lot of points, more tables and figures. If you think about a paper in Nature and Science, I think like now they have like 100 or whatever supplemental files. Like, who is going to read that? But the question is that what do we do? I mean, it's a real issue. I mean, with AI, it's nice that you can summarize a long paper, etc. So I think that's why I think I'm so positive about using AI to help research, right? But the question is real. The problem is real, that we actually don't have time to read so many papers. So I'm thinking like, well, is it possible to actually try to adopt another way of doing paper, like writing a shorter paper? Because in the sense that a paper is just convey value, right? And you think about value density, per value per time unit of reading, per space, content, whatever you want to call it. If you think about it, you want to increase the value density, then why not just write shorter papers, right? Because shorter papers get a better chance of getting read, right? I think if you think about it in psychology at least, like, I know you're not sure whether you're familiar with this journal, like Cognitive Psychology, JEP. These used to be really classic top journals and published really long papers. If you look at the impact factor, they're declining every year almost, right? Why? Well, I think one reason is last reason, but one reason I would say it's just not a good investment of time to read such a long paper. As I said, this attention economic. With the shorter paper, you get a better chance. Like psychological science is relatively short, and of course, the top journal like Science, Nature, PNAS, whatever.
Short and sweet.
Yeah, short papers. I mean, they could have lots of data, but more like supplemental. It's unfortunate people don't really read those things, but at least the main paper get better than if you write a really lengthy paper. So I think I used to emphasize, like as authors, we really value like longer paper is better. I mean, I don't, for some reason, right? I think you sort of want to do that, but then, I mean, I'm not sure about you. Like, at least when I was writing a paper, like 2 years ago or something like that, I would say, oh, I want to write a longer paper. It sounds better. It sounds whatever. But now, when I think about it, no, I should write a shorter paper. If you think about value things, right? If you write a longer paper, you have to spend so much time to read it. It's just not as valuable as like you make it shorter, right? So anyway, that is, I'm just ending here. It's like a thought. I'm not necessarily saying that it's going to, like, people agree with it, but just I think it seems to be reasonable, at least based on the kind of observation I have. If you want to read, if you want to, the papers I talked about today, I'll just send the paper to this WeChat group if you have one, and if you want to read those papers. So it's really, I think 1.5 hours for 340. Yeah, I asked you before, like, well, should I stick to 1 hour? Because I know if I want to cover every aspect, it's going to be really long. Because I have a really long series of writing lectures.
Nice.
And I did since education, like that would be like 1 semester stuff. That's just not impossible. Sort of thing. Yeah. I know, like, because writing is complicated. It's not like you can do it just like at 1 lecture or 1 whatever. You have to practice it, and you have to do it like ongoing, like sort of any one-on-one, sort of like lots of feedback and sort of thing. It's hard. It's hard. Writing is hard.
Especially, I think it's hard to teach, to train students.
Yeah, they have to want to write well. They have to want to read. You can't force anyone to write better. I would say something. For example, for me, why do I write relatively well? Because I really think it's important. I want to write well. I really want to write well. You got pleasure, like, it's the arts. Like, you draw a painting or whatever. You want to make it as perfect as you can make it, even though you know it's never going to reach that state. Because nothing is really perfect. But you take pleasure in writing good work, right? Anyway.
Because I mean, you think clearly. It boils down, you have to think clearly.
Yeah, that's very important. Yeah, but sometimes writing helps you think.
Yes.
That's also an important thing. So I think it's a bi-directional. Like, sometimes you have some idea, but in the writing process, you clarify your thought, you change your thoughts. So that's why I think writing is so important. You can just think without writing. Of course, you can just keep writing without thinking. It's sort of like a cycle. Very interesting dynamic. It can like reinforce each other. So yeah, so it's really important to write well, learn to write, and yeah, but you also want to. Anyways, this bi-directional. Happy to take any question if you want to.
Questions? It's a lengthy talk, but I think it's insightful, and I think it really helps. Really, very important tips. Right.
I think this sort of talk will be more appropriate for like graduate students and postdoc and junior faculty, because for undergraduate, I don't know. Like, when I was an undergraduate, I'm sort of I wrote papers when I was an undergraduate student, but that's where most undergraduate have.
It's also important, I think, for professors of all levels, because I mean, I struggle with teaching students how to write well.
Yeah, it's hard.
And then it's important to know.
Yeah. I think it's kind of writing is always important thing. One thing that is kind of interesting is because I'm not sure, like, there's lots of controversy about language versus thoughts. Could you evaluate a person's quality based on writing? Could you not? I think it's complicated. Like, for example, some PhD advisors, professors, will evaluate students based on their writing. That sometimes is fair, sometimes not fair. So I don't know. But this is really complicated because it's really hard to write well if you don't think clearly. So certainly writing can reflect some sort of thinking, but it's also not a perfect reflection of measurement of thinking. So anyway, so bring them notes.
Very good.
Any questions, comments?
So
I'm also happy to take questions from online.
yeah.
You don't have to ask questions specific with my talk. I'm really very open-minded. You can ask whatever question you have.
Yeah, a question.
Yeah, go ahead.
Graduate students from teach school of the arts. I'm studying interactive media arts here, and we have some interdisciplinary studies about affective computing,
Ah, cool. Yeah.
neuroscience spectrum. How do you see the AI as a the updated research about human emotion?
Ah.
Because we study well, if you can have any patterns recognition, if things can study with certain rules, it's easy to outsource the tasks to AI. But what about human emotion?
Yeah.
The recent research so far.
Good question. Thank you for the question. Do you have so I think, for example, my own research, we are exploring using language model as a computational cognitive science, computational social science tool. So for example, you can have text or you can have image. Now the question is, for example, you can do emotional classification. This is helpful, for example, if you do think about psychological counseling, depression, anxiety, whatever, emotional state, you infer that, right? Or political science, for example, you can think about political leaning, right? Attitude, etc. So that's one way we try to do, to use language model to classify this text, right? Another thing is image. For example, you can think about image. We are doing something like we want to try to use language model to classify image. Like, for example, the meaningless. That is not necessarily emotional, but more semantic. That's because I'm more like cognitive science, because we study, for example, eye gaze, addiction, this sort of thing. And there are lots of research showing that attention sometimes not necessarily guided by the saliency or how conspicuous it is, but also by the meaningfulness of the scene. But in getting back to a question about arts and emotion, I think the same thing is here, that language model per se, I would say, have no emotion, no consciousness, whatever, but they're very good at picking up these signals of emotion. I call it latent psychology. Latent in the sense that this psychological state or emotion are embedded or reflected in the text or in image, whatever you want to call it, right? So I think language model, I would say, is really helpful in the sense that you can use it as annotator, like RA, that code your text or image. You can use language model. That's what we're trying to do, to sort of replace human efforts, human labors in terms of classification. I'm not sure that answers the question, but that's some of my thoughts.
Yeah, is that true that training a large language model is too expensive at this moment? So it's more cost effective to use existing LLM in the markets.
So if you mean like foundational model, because remember I talked about two steps. One called foundational, one called fine tuning. The foundation model is almost I don't think it's feasible for us here, but fine tuning is possible. It's just mostly I would say just use the best language model, large language model. I don't think it's feasible here or anywhere actually, like a common laboratory, because it takes a lot of resources. GPU. I don't think we have enough GPU to do any of these things, but we can do fine tuning. So that's, for example, we are doing like, for example, we're trying to fine tune. For example, we want to classify a paper based on the task it is, and we have human coded papers, and then we use that as training, and we sort of like try to use that to fine tune the model and to predict subsequent new papers. So that's how we do it. That's feasible. It takes some resources, but not too bad. But I wouldn't say it's feasible to do a foundational model like GPT, whatever.
Any other questions?
I know you're not shy. You just hire.
You can ask the questions in Chinese if.
Yeah, no problem at all. Or you can use 早上话.
There is a question from online.
You want to read it?
Curiosity, is any part of his talk generated, assisted by AI?
Oh, yes, the first part, the image. I think. Let me go. Yes, this part. Nothing else.
Good.
Image, yeah. I use the prompt here, right? I use the prompt in GPT. An illustration of writing in person. Change the title. And just, but important that using white background. Because that looks much better.
I like it.
I think it's helpful to use AI to help us do PowerPoint as well. Right?
Really? They can generate PowerPoint?
Yeah, they can, but I don't think it's that helpful right now. At least the tool I use is not very good. So, but as you can see, I can use it some elements. I mean, eventually, I'm sure it can help some aspects of PowerPoint presentation. I know there's a tool I used it once. That was the last year, but it wasn't good at all. So I didn't.
Any other questions? So you brought down, you can write good papers. It's useful for you to write good papers. Less than Professor Zhi Chengling for a wonderful talk. Dinner, 宵夜 in Taipei, we leave at 5:15.